What would you do if the man you loved stood before hundreds of strangers and pretended you no longer existed? Margaret Prescott had given everything to her marriage: grace, loyalty, and the quiet strength of a woman building a family. 6 months pregnant, she should have been resting at home. But when her husband walked into a charity gala with another woman on his arm, she didn't disappear. She showed up, not to cause a scene, but to remind him and everyone watching that silence is not the same as surrender. Now imagine it was you. Would you stay behind, heartbroken and humiliated, or would you walk into that room, head held high, and take back your name? This isn't just a story of betrayal. It's about reclaiming space in a world that's too quick to erase quiet women. It's about walking with dignity into the storm and not flinching when the room turns. If you've ever been written out of your own story, this one is for you. Please like this video, share it with someone who needs a reminder of their worth, and subscribe to Shining Stories. Because sometimes the most powerful person in the room is the one who walks in last. Now let's begin. The Cambridge Grand Hotel stood like a monument to old-world luxury in the heart of Boston, with its vaulted ceilings, intricate moldings, and candlelit chandeliers. It looked as though time had decided to pause there, if only to admire its own reflection. It was the night of the Hearts of Tomorrow Gala, one of the most coveted invitations among the East Coast elite. The ballroom buzzed with the sounds of laughter, softened by string quartets, the clinking of glasses, and the rustle of designer gowns sweeping polished marble floors. Wealth had a way of speaking without words. It was in the scent of imported lilies flown in from Florence. It lingered in the way the waiters moved silent, efficient, invisible, and it gleamed unmistakably in the presence of William Prescott, the tech mogul whose AI startup had reshaped healthcare systems across the country. Tonight, he arrived precisely as expected, calculated, camera-ready, and commanding. But he wasn't alone. On his arm was a woman no one had seen before Charlotte Vale, young, stunning, and dressed in a crimson silk gown that defied modesty and tradition in equal measure. Her blonde waves were pinned artfully to one side, her smile an enigma somewhere between conquest and performance. Whispers rippled through the crowd like a gust of cold air. "Is that his new PR assistant?" someone murmured behind a flute of champagne. "No, she's something else entirely," another voice replied, eyes fixed on the couple. William's smile never wavered. He moved through the ballroom like a man who believed the night belonged to him, and for the most part, it did. The media loved him, investors adored him, and those who envied him, well, they were clever enough to keep it to themselves, on stage. The MC cleared his throat and gestured toward the central table, now occupied by William and Charlotte. "Ladies and gentlemen," the MC began, "we're honored to have among us this evening the visionary behind Prescott Technologies, whose generous donation has ensured that hundreds of underserved children will receive the education they deserve." Applause broke out. William stood, nodded graciously, and placed a hand on Charlotte's lower back as if to say, "This is my night. This is my life." From a distance, it looked perfect, too perfect. But then, the air shifted. Near the grand entrance of the ballroom, the doors creaked open just enough for the doorman to glance nervously toward the center of the room. A moment passed, then a tall figure stepped through. Nathan Hart, the famously private CEO of Hart and Alden Capital. His presence alone would have been enough to stir attention, but it was the woman beside him that made the room gasp. She wasn't just any guest. She was Margaret Prescott, William's wife, 6 months pregnant and radiant in a navy blue gown that fell gracefully over her growing belly. Her chestnut hair was pulled into a simple, elegant twist. She wore no diamonds, no glittering insignia of wealth, only resolve. The music faltered, just slightly, enough to be noticed. Guests turned. Some instinctively reached for their phones. Others leaned toward each other in disbelief. William's hand dropped from Charlotte's back. His eyes locked onto Margaret, and for the first time that evening, the smile vanished from his face. Far from the glittering lights of Boston, nestled in the stillness of Vermont's countryside, the Willow Creek estate stood quietly against a backdrop of bare winter trees. The air smelled of pine and distant smoke from the fireplace inside. Snow clung softly to the eaves like nature itself had paused to watch something unfolding. Inside, Margaret Prescott sat curled in a deep armchair, wrapped in a thick gray sweater, one hand resting over her growing belly. The fire crackled, but she barely noticed. Her eyes were fixed on a photograph on the mantel, an image of her and William taken 2 winters ago in Aspen. They were laughing, bundled in coats and scarves, snow in their hair, love in their eyes. She hadn't looked at that photo in months. Now, it felt like looking at a memory from someone else's life. The silence in the room was different tonight, not peaceful, but heavy, like it was holding something back, like it knew something she didn't. Her fingers curled reflexively around her mug of chamomile tea, now gone cold. She hadn't expected William to come home that evening. He'd left that morning in his usual rush, briefcase in hand, tie already knotted. Back late investors in town, he'd said, barely brushing her cheek on the way out. No mention of the gala, no mention of where he'd really be. It wasn't just tonight. Margaret had grown used to being alone. In the early days of their marriage, William had been attentive, even tender. He would make her breakfast on Sundays, call her 3 times a day when he traveled. When they discovered she was pregnant, he wept. Actual tears. That night, he'd held her like he never wanted to let go. But somewhere along the way, his arms had loosened. He became a man of early mornings and late flights, a man of silence. He stopped asking how she felt. He stopped noticing the swollen ankles, the nausea, the restlessness. She tried not to blame him. She told herself he was building something for their future, for their child. But, late at night, when the wind howled through the trees and sleep refused to come, she wondered, was he building something for them or running away from something in her? Margaret shifted in the chair and glanced at her phone. No messages, no calls. She opened her calendar. The gala was tonight. She knew about it only in passing a brief mention in one of William's interviews. He hadn't invited her, not even out of obligation. Her heart clenched. Was it because she couldn't wear her pre-pregnancy gowns anymore, because her presence would ruin the illusion? She let out a slow breath, the kind that hurt on the way out. The baby kicked softly beneath her palm, as if reminding her that she was not entirely alone. "I'm okay," she whispered into the fire. "We're okay. We'll be okay." But the words felt fragile, like porcelain on the verge of cracking. On the coffee table in front of her lay a book she'd been reading, half finished, a knitted blanket, a notebook filled with baby name ideas. Life here had a rhythm quiet, familiar, but it was also starting to feel like a waiting room for something inevitable, something unnamed, something she didn't want to see. Her phone buzzed suddenly, slicing through the hush like glass shattering on hardwood. Elaine Monroe. The name stopped her heart. Elaine had once been William's corporate attorney, sharp, fiercely loyal, and one of the few people Margaret trusted completely. Why would she be calling this late? Margaret hesitated, then swiped to answer. Elaine. There was a long pause on the other end, followed by a breath shaky, uncertain. "Margaret," Elaine said gently, I wouldn't be calling if it weren't important." Margaret sat up straighter. "What is it?" "You need to know something. William, he's at the gala tonight, but he's not alone. He brought someone, a woman." Silence stretched between them. Margaret felt the room spin, her breath catching. Elaine continued, voice barely above a whisper. "She's not just a colleague. Margaret." He introduced her as his date. The words fell like thunder in Margaret's chest. A dozen images crashed into her mind. William leaving early, the new cologne, the guarded phone calls, the avoidance of eye contact. "I'm so sorry," Elaine said. "I thought you should hear it from me before it hits the tabloids." Margaret said nothing. Her hand was trembling, resting over the child that carried both his DNA and her dreams. She didn't cry, not yet. Instead, she whispered, "Thank you, Elaine," and ended the call. Outside, the snow continued to fall, soft and oblivious. Inside, Margaret sat in stillness, not of despair, but of decision. Something was changing, and she could feel it rising, like a tide. The snow had stopped, but inside the Willow Creek estate, the silence grew heavier, as though the house itself were holding its breath. Margaret Prescott hadn't moved since ending the call with Elaine Monroe. Her phone lay face down on the armrest, as if touching it again would make the words disappear, but they lingered, etched into her mind like frost on glass. He introduced her as his date. It was the final puzzle piece. Everything she hadn't wanted to believe fell into place. The absences, the silence, the subtle shift in William's eyes when she mentioned the baby registry, the quick dismissal of her concerns. She'd seen the signs but had prayed they meant something less cruel. She looked down at her belly, her hand trembling as it traced a soft circle over the place where life was quietly forming. A movement stirred gentle, like a whisper of reassurance. She exhaled, the breath slow and jagged. Then she stood. She didn't know why at first. Maybe instinct, maybe dignity, maybe something deeper, an old part of herself waking up after too long in slumber. She walked toward the hallway mirror and stopped. The woman staring back wasn't the one from the wedding photos. She was older, yes, but not broken. There were tired lines near her eyes, and a softness to her jaw that hadn't been there before. But there was also clarity. Something steady. She reached for her scarf, looped it around her neck, and moved to the foyer. The air was sharper there, crisp from the draft that snuck in through the old window panes. That's when a soft knock came at the door. 3 slow, deliberate taps. Her brows furrowed. No one ever came this late. Not up here. Not without calling. She opened the door cautiously and froze. Standing beneath the porch light was Nathan Hart. Stillness passed between them for a moment, like snow hanging in the air before it touches ground. "Nathan," she whispered, almost uncertain she was awake. He gave a small nod. "Evening. Margaret, I hope I'm not intruding." He looked older than she remembered, lines around his eyes deeper, hair grayer at the temples. But there was something familiar in the way he stood, a quiet presence, like a mountain refusing to bow to the wind. She stepped aside. "Come in. Please. Inside." He took off his coat and glanced around. "Same wallpaper," he said, smiling faintly. "I was never much for redecorating," Margaret replied, managing a small smile. "Did you drive all the way from Boston?" "I did." He paused. "Elaine called me too." Margaret's throat tightened. "Of course she did. I came because I've seen this storm before, and I know what it can do if you face it alone." She didn't speak. Not yet. She walked to the fireplace and stared into the flames. "I think the part that hurts most," she said finally, "isn't that he brought her. It's that I'm not surprised anymore." Nathan stepped closer, his voice low. "I remember when William couldn't go 2 hours without texting you. He used to say you were his compass." Margaret gave a short, bitter laugh. Apparently the compass got boring. "No," Nathan said quietly. He just stopped listening to it. She turned to face him fully. "So what now?" "Nathan, do I go there? Do I show up at that gala like a scandal headline?" He didn't answer right away. Instead, he looked at her, not just at her face, but into her, the way old friends do when they know you've been carrying too much for too long. "I don't think this is about showing up for them," he said. "It's about showing up for you." She tilted her head, questioning. "You have nothing to be ashamed of, Margaret. You've been loyal, patient, kind, but you're not invisible. And if he's chosen to forget that in front of an entire city, you have every right to remind him who you are." Silence fell again, but this time it wasn't hollow. It was full of weight, of decision, of quiet strength returning. Margaret looked down at her hand resting on her stomach. She deserves to know her mother didn't just disappear. Nathan asked, a hint of surprise in his voice. Margaret confirmed, a tear escaping as she smiled. Nathan's features softened. "Then let her see you strong." Another pause. Then Margaret asked, "Will you come with me?" He didn't hesitate. "Yes." The morning light filtered through the kitchen windows at Willow Creek Estate, pale and cold, casting long shadows across the wooden floor. The world outside was still hushed under a blanket of snow, but inside, something had shifted. Margaret Prescott stood at the kitchen counter, her hands gently slicing an apple. The motion was methodical, almost meditative. She wasn't hungry, but the act of preparing something, anything, offered a small sense of control. Across from her, Nathan Hart sat with a steaming cup of coffee. He hadn't said much since their conversation the night before. He understood silence. He respected it. It was one of the reasons Margaret had always trusted him. "You didn't sleep much," he said softly, not as a question but a quiet observation. Margaret shrugged, placing the apple slices onto a small plate. "Sleep is complicated lately." Nathan offered a small smile. "I remember when my sister was pregnant. She said sleep disappears somewhere around month 5 and doesn't return until college." Margaret chuckled, surprised by the lightness in her own voice. "Sounds about right." A brief pause settled between them, but it wasn't uncomfortable. In fact, it felt like the calm before something necessary, inevitable. She sat down, folding her hands in her lap. "I thought I'd feel rage," she said quietly. "I thought I'd want to scream or break things, but I don't." Nathan tilted his head, listening. "I just feel clear, like the fog has lifted." Her gaze met his, "And I know what I have to do." He nodded. "Say it out loud." She took a breath. "I'm going to the gala." Nathan didn't react with surprise, only a softening of his eyes, a silent gesture of support, but not to cause a scene. She continued. "Not for him. Not even for her." Then for who, Nathan asked. "For me," Margaret said. "For my daughter, so that when she grows up and asks me what I did when her father paraded another woman in front of the world, I'll have an answer I'm proud of." The words hung in the air, heavy with truth and grace. "I don't want to fight," she added, her voice steady, "but I won't be erased." Nathan reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small envelope. "I had a feeling you'd say that." She raised an eyebrow. "What's this A driver? Discreet." "Trusted. He'll take us into Boston. Wait as long as needed. I've already made the call." Margaret smiled faintly. "You always were 10 steps ahead." He stood and handed her the envelope. "I don't know what this night will bring, but I do know you'll walk in with your head high." She rose too, moving slowly, one hand instinctively over her stomach. She deserves to see that strength starts in silence, not in shouting. Nathan studied her for a moment. "You know, when William and I first started working together, I saw a man who had vision, but he was impulsive, unpolished. You changed that. You grounded him. You made him human. Then he outgrew his own humanity." Margaret murmured. "No," Nathan said. "He just forgot where it came from." They stood in the hallway now, the coat closet open. Margaret slipped into a long, navy wool coat, her scarf folded with care. She moved with the poise of someone not trying to impress, but to reclaim. In the bedroom, she'd chosen a maternity gown, deep midnight blue, simple, elegant, sleeveless with a gentle flare. It hugged her body without flaunting it, speaking of quiet dignity rather than spectacle. Around her wrist, she wore a silver bracelet William had given her years ago, not as a reminder of him, but as a reminder of who she had been, even before him. By the time they stepped outside, the snow had melted into slush, the air crisp but calm. A black town car waited quietly at the base of the long driveway, the driver stepping forward to assist her in. Margaret turned to Nathan. "Whatever happens tonight," she said, "thank you." "You're not alone," he replied. As the car pulled away, winding through the sleepy back roads toward Boston, Margaret rested her hand on her stomach and closed her eyes. She wasn't seeking revenge. She wasn't trying to win. She was walking into the room simply to exist, to remind the world, and William Prescott, that she still mattered. And that was enough. The Cambridge Grand Hotel had never looked more opulent. Floodlights lit up its historic stone facade, casting a golden glow across the steps leading to the grand entrance. Luxury cars lined the curb, valets moved like dancers in pressed suits, and camera flashes popped like fireworks along the velvet rope. Inside, the Hearts of Tomorrow gala was in full swing. The ballroom was a sea of tailored tuxedos, sparkling gowns, and curated laughter. Waiters floated between guests with trays of smoked salmon canapés and flutes of Veuve Clicquot. A string quartet played Vivaldi with mechanical precision, their notes falling like lace over the murmurs of finance, foundation pledges, and whispered scandals. At the center of it all stood William Prescott, resplendent in a custom midnight tuxedo, glass of scotch in hand, smile carefully crafted. At his side was Charlotte Vale, radiant in a floor-length red silk dress that left little to the imagination and even less to tradition. She clung to William's arm, all poise and confidence, her gaze sweeping the crowd like she was born into this world. But the truth was, she wasn't, and some of the guests knew it. Still, William seemed pleased. He greeted old investors and new donors with the charm of a man convinced nothing could go wrong. He leaned in to whisper in Charlotte's ear, "A performance for the cameras," until one of the junior reporters from a local outlet dropped their voice recorder mid-question and froze. "What's wrong?" Charlotte asked, eyes narrowing. The young woman didn't answer. She simply pointed. William followed her gaze, and everything stopped. At the far end of the ballroom, just past the grand staircase, the double doors opened, and there she was, Margaret Prescott. Time slowed. Her gown was deep navy, modest in design but regal in presence. Her posture was straight. Her hands rested calmly over her pregnant belly. Her hair was pulled into a soft chignon, understated earrings glinting beneath the crystal chandeliers. She wasn't flashy. She didn't need to be. Beside her stood Nathan Hart, equally composed, his expression unreadable. They walked in together, shoulder to shoulder, not clinging, not defensive, just present. The room turned. Literally. Heads swiveled, mouths parted, murmurs rose like steam from boiling water. She came. Someone whispered, "With Nathan Hart." "No. That can't be. He never appears in public. Isn't she 6 months along?" Look at William's face. Yes, William's face. He had gone pale. His grip on his scotch glass tightened. Charlotte sensed the change in his body language immediately and stepped slightly in front of him, as if shielding him from something bigger than she could understand. Margaret's eyes found his across the ballroom. She didn't smile. She didn't scowl. She simply held his gaze the way one might study a painting of someone they used to love. William blinked first. Nathan leaned toward Margaret and said something softly. She nodded, and together they made their way down the marble steps. Reporters who had been angling for glamorous couple photos all night now surged forward. Flashbulbs erupted. Questions flew. "Mrs. Prescott, are you here to respond to Mr. Prescott's new relationship?" "Nathan, is this a partnership or something more?" Margaret didn't answer. Neither did Nathan. Their silence, in that moment, was louder than anything William or Charlotte had said all evening. By the time they reached the ballroom floor, guests were already parting like the Red Sea. The path to William was clear, but Margaret didn't take it. Not yet. Instead, she turned to greet Marion Lowell, one of the gala's main board members. They exchanged polite words. Nothing dramatic, nothing accusatory, just presence, just grace. Charlotte leaned into William's ear. "What is this?" He didn't answer. He couldn't. For the first time in months, maybe years, he wasn't in control. And he knew it. Margaret moved through the ballroom with a stillness that defied the chaos. Guests couldn't stop watching. There was no shouting, no confrontation. Not yet. But the tension in the air was electric, and everyone knew the night had changed. The string quartet played on, but even Mozart couldn't drown the current crackling in the air. As Margaret Prescott and Nathan Hart moved further into the ballroom, the whispers only grew louder, sharper, bolder. William tried to remain composed, but a pulse had begun to throb in his temple. He could feel every eye in the room shifting away from him and onto her. Charlotte's fingers clenched around her champagne flute. She could sense it too. The spotlight was no longer theirs. William whispered sharply, "What the hell is she doing here?" Charlotte turned toward him, feigning control. "Isn't this what you wanted?" Attention. He ignored her. adjusting his cufflinks like he could smooth out the unraveling threads of his life. Across the room, Nathan murmured something to Margaret. She nodded. Then, she turned and walked directly toward William. The crowd instinctively parted. Conversation stopped mid-sentence. It was as if the air itself thinned, holding its breath. When they were just a few steps apart, Margaret stopped. Her voice was calm. "Good evening, William." He swallowed hard, then forced a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Margaret, I didn't expect to see you tonight." Her gaze didn't flicker. That much is clear. His eyes darted toward her belly, then back up. "You look, well." "I am," she replied. "Carrying your child seems to agree with me." A silence followed that cut deeper than any insult. Charlotte stepped forward, her voice dripping with false sweetness. "We were just about to make the opening toast. Would you care to join us?" Margaret turned to her, offering a measured look. "I wouldn't want to interrupt your debut," she said, voice low, but unmistakably pointed. "You've waited long enough to be seen, haven't you?" A collective intake of breath swept through the onlookers. Charlotte's smile faltered, her eyes narrowing. Nathan took a single step forward, not threatening, but present. William tried to regain control. "Margaret, perhaps we could speak privately." "No," she said. "No more private conversations. Not after you made our silence a public performance." His jaw tightened. Margaret continued, her voice still calm. "You could have come to me. You could have said it was over, but instead, you put on a show." She turned her attention to Charlotte. "And you played your part beautifully." Charlotte opened her mouth to reply, but Margaret had already shifted her gaze back to William. "I didn't come here for a scene," she said. "I came so you'd know that I see you clearly now, not as the man I married, but as the man you chose to become." The words landed like thunder, and then, with grace that belied the storm inside her. Margaret turned to walk away, but William stepped forward. "You think I'm proud of this," he said under his breath. "You think I don't feel something watching you walk in like that." She stopped, but didn't turn around. "Feeling something isn't the same as doing something," she said, "and you did nothing when it mattered." Nathan placed a hand on her back, gently guiding her forward. The silence behind them was deafening. As they walked away, Margaret whispered to him, "I didn't want to break him." Nathan's voice was quiet, steady. "You didn't." He broke himself. By the next morning, the headlines had already written themselves. Pregnant wife. Confronts billionaire at gala, with rival CEO by her side. Hearts of tomorrow. Gala erupts in scandal. Prescott family, no longer untouchable. Charlotte Vale. The other woman at the center of the Prescott affair. Screens lit up across Boston and beyond. Phones buzzing, articles shared, podcast hosts speculating on timelines, motives, alliances. But at the Willow Creek estate, Margaret Prescott wasn't reading headlines. She sat by the window, her feet up on a velvet stool, one hand resting on her belly as soft morning light filtered through the sheer curtains. Nathan Hart had stayed the night in the guest cottage, understanding that solitude was sacred, but quiet support even more so. A tray of toast and tea sat untouched beside her. She wasn't hungry. She wasn't sad, either. She was still. And for the first time in months, stillness didn't feel like a prison. It felt like choice. In contrast, chaos had taken root elsewhere, at the Cambridge Grand. Hotel staff were still cleaning up after the gala. But for William Prescott, the real mess wasn't on the ballroom floor. It was in the court of public opinion. His inbox had exploded. PR reps begging for statements. Lawyers asking if he had prior NDAs that needed revisiting. Board members calling emergency meetings. Investors demanding clarity. And most damaging of all, Nathan Hart's name now attached to the story. Not in scandal, but in reputation. The media quickly reframed the narrative not just about a philandering billionaire, but about a woman who had once been invisible, now returning not alone, but with one of the most respected men in finance standing beside her. Charlotte, meanwhile, had gone silent. She had slipped out of William's penthouse before dawn, offering no note, no explanation. Her absence wasn't dramatic, it was strategic. She had seen the look on the guests' faces when Margaret arrived. She had heard the change in tone. She understood how fast high society could turn. William slammed his laptop shut in frustration. He hadn't anticipated this. Not the headlines, not the public sympathy shifting toward Margaret, certainly not the sudden way Charlotte, so ambitious, so eager, had vanished without warning. He rubbed his temples, the beginnings of a migraine pressing against his skull. A knock came at the door. His assistant, pale and visibly tense, stepped in. "Sir, there's talk that Hart and Alden is reviewing your tech licensing agreements." William's breath caught. "Nathan," he asked. He wouldn't do that. The assistant didn't answer, because they both knew he would, if it meant protecting Margaret, if it meant keeping William accountable. That was the thing about Nathan Hart. He didn't play the media. He didn't seek revenge. But he acted when lines were crossed. Meanwhile, social media flooded with support for Margaret. Women mothers, daughters, wives shared messages, tagging her name, praising her composure. She walked in like a queen. One post read, "No yelling, no drama, just dignity." Some even started calling her the quiet storm. Margaret saw none of it firsthand, but Elaine Monroe sent her updates through voice messages. "You're trending," she said, half laughing, "and I don't mean in the tabloid way. People are actually rooting for you." Margaret smiled faintly. She didn't need their applause, but she welcomed their recognition. That evening, Nathan returned to the main house. She was in the study, lighting a fire, the baby kicking gently beneath her sweater. He watched her for a moment before speaking. "Your silence shook the city," he said. Margaret glanced up, a flicker of dry amusement in her eyes. "Wasn't planning to be an earthquake." "You weren't," he said, "but you stood on solid ground, and everyone felt it, across the city." William sat alone in his penthouse. The whiskey didn't burn like it used to. The silence didn't soothe. The skyline, once a source of pride, now looked like a wall of glass he couldn't break through. He replayed Margaret's words again and again in his mind. "I see you clearly now. Not as the man I married, but as the man you chose to become." Somewhere deep within him, something cracked, and for the first time in a very long time, William Prescott felt afraid, not of losing money, not even of losing power, but of having finally lost the only person who had ever truly seen him and stayed. The days after the gala stretched like gray silk, quiet, unyielding, and full of tension beneath the surface. At the Willow Creek estate, Margaret Prescott found herself waking earlier, her mind sharper, her steps steadier. It wasn't that the pain had vanished, it hadn't, but something inside her had calcified into resolve. She no longer waited for William's calls. She no longer checked social media to track Charlotte's appearances. And most importantly, she no longer asked herself what she could have done differently. Some betrayals, she had come to understand, had nothing to do with who you were, only with what the other person refused to become. Meanwhile, across the city, William Prescott stood in front of his office window, watching the city move on without him. He hadn't heard from Charlotte since the morning after the gala. She had cleared her things from his apartment while he was still fielding damage control calls. Her exit was surgical, clean, ruthless. A single note had been left behind on his kitchen counter. "I didn't sign up to go down with the ship. You should have warned me she was still in the picture." See no tears. No regrets. Just distance. William poured himself a glass of scotch, but didn't drink it. He stared at his own reflection in the window, disheveled, tired, lost. His board of directors had issued a statement distancing themselves from his personal entanglements. Investors were calling less often. He felt like a man slowly being pushed out of his own empire. He turned away from the window and sat down at his desk. An unopened envelope lay beside his keyboard, marked Prescott v. Prescott Preliminary Notice of Separation. His heart panged, not just for the name on the envelope, but because for the first time, he realized she was serious. Margaret didn't send it with malice. She had gone over every line of the agreement with Elaine Monroe, asking not for vengeance, but fairness, full custody, reasonable visitation, a secure trust for the child's education, no public statements unless approved mutually, It wasn't a weapon, it was a boundary. Elaine had been impressed. "You're doing this with more grace than I've seen in 20 years of divorce law," she said. Margaret had smiled softly. "I'm not trying to win. I'm trying to walk away without losing myself." In those same days, Nathan Hart became a quiet presence in her life, not hovering, not insisting, simply being there. They shared long walks around the snowy edge of the property, talking about everything but William, about childhoods, about regrets, about books and music, and whether their country had forgotten the meaning of decency. "You ever think," Margaret asked one afternoon, "that life doesn't give second chances, it just gives louder lessons?" Nathan looked at her, eyes gentle. "I used to, but then I met someone who turned a heartbreak into a platform for grace." She looked away, hiding the warmth in her cheeks. "He didn't push. He never did." Back in the city, William tried to reclaim control. He issued a formal apology in the press, sterile and overly rehearsed. He made a small charitable donation in Margaret's name, transparent and poorly received. He attempted to schedule a private meeting with Nathan, who declined with a single line, "Speak to your wife, not through proxies." Each attempt to steady the ship made him look more lost. Even his closest staff began resigning. The walls were closing in, and for the first time, William realized that his greatest loss wasn't the headlines or the investor pullouts. It was the silence from Margaret's end, because it wasn't angry anymore. It was final. Back in Vermont, Margaret spent her evenings sorting baby clothes, soft yellows and sage greens, a mobile of hand-sewn birds for the nursery, a shelf already full of books she'd once loved as a child. She paused on a small photo she had tucked inside a box, an image of her and William during their honeymoon in coastal Maine, his arms around her waist, her laughter frozen in time. She stared at it for a long moment. Then she placed it face down in the drawer, not thrown away, but laid to rest. The first day Margaret Prescott stepped onto the grounds of the Eastwood Women's Center. The air was crisp with late winter, and the gravel crunched beneath her boots like fresh beginnings. The old building had once been a boarding school, abandoned for years, with peeling shutters and ivy overtaking its stone facade. But where others saw decay, Margaret saw possibility. Quietly, with the help of Nathan Hart and a handful of private donors, she had secured the space. Now, it was hers. A place for women like her, for women left behind, walked out on, silenced, underestimated women who needed not just shelter, but solidarity. The name was simple: Roots and Grace. Roots for what anchored you. Grace for what carried you through. It had started with an idea, a conversation one night over tea and thick wool blankets. Nathan had said, "You have more to offer than silence, Margaret. What you lived through, that has power, that has reach." At first, she had resisted. She didn't want to become a symbol, didn't want to be the face of resilience. She just wanted peace. But peace, she realized, isn't passive. Peace is chosen. And if she had to rebuild from the ground up, why not build something that could shelter others too? The center opened quietly. No ribbon cutting, no press release, just a few women, one counselor, and a row of secondhand cribs freshly painted. Margaret spent her mornings in the office balancing checkbooks, managing meal plans, working with Elaine to draft policies. In the afternoons, she taught workshops, self-advocacy, basic financial literacy, writing as healing. In the evenings, she sat by the fire with the women who stayed there talking, sometimes just listening, and always. Her hand would rest on her belly. Her daughter hadn't been born yet, but in many ways, Margaret had already become a mother, to herself, to others, to a future still unwritten. Word spread. A journalist who had covered the gala scandal asked to do a follow-up piece, not on the affair, but on the aftermath. Margaret declined the interview, but she sent back a note. "When the story stops being about who hurt whom and starts being about what we do next, then I'll talk." One night, after a long board meeting, Nathan stayed behind to help stack chairs. The staff had gone home, and the hall was quiet except for the tick of an old wall clock. Margaret sat at the edge of the stage, sipping mint tea, watching him. "You could have walked away too, you know," she said. He looked up. "From what? From all of this? From me?" Nathan set the last chair down gently. "I didn't stay because I pitied you. Margaret, I stayed because I respect you. She nodded, but something about her gaze held a quiet doubt. It's hard to believe in goodness after you've seen the opposite so closely. Nathan moved to sit beside her. You didn't just survive betrayal. You gave it no power over your future. That's not just good, Margaret. That's rare. She turned to him. Do you think it's possible to love again? Not out of need, not out of loneliness, but out of something deeper. He didn't rush to answer. Then he said softly, I don't know about again, but I believe it's possible to love differently, wiser, freer. They sat in silence for a while, shoulders barely touching, a kind of closeness more intimate than touch. That night, Margaret wrote a letter she never intended to send. To her daughter, you were born not into perfection, but into truth. You were not the reason I stayed quiet. You were the reason I spoke. When you ask me someday why I didn't hide, I'll tell you, because your name deserved to begin with dignity. She folded the letter and placed it in a box marked, for Grace, when she's ready. The tide had turned, and Margaret, she was no longer drifting. She was sailing on her own wind. The office lights were dimmed now, less by design and more by neglect. William Prescott sat alone at the long conference table in the Prescott Technologies boardroom. The once sleek walls of glass and steel now reflected only the sharp edges of discomfort. His reflection in the blackened window looked foreign hair slightly overgrown. The collar of his dress shirt wrinkled, not broken, perhaps, but undeniably worn down. An unopened folder lay before him. Stamped in bold at the top, subpoena, SEC investigation subject, Prescott Technologies. Foreign licensing violations. He'd seen it coming. He just never thought it would actually arrive. Weeks ago, whispers had begun rumors about offshore shell contracts, aggressive lobbying donations, and internal audit manipulation. Nothing concrete, just tremors. Now, the earthquake had arrived. The board had already begun distancing itself. A temporary leave of absence was being negotiated in hushed emails. Staff no longer greeted him with eye contact. And, worst of all, his name was being quietly erased from his own legacy. William stared at the folder. He didn't open it. Instead, he reached for his phone. The screen glowed back at him, empty of new messages. He scrolled past Charlotte's name. She hadn't called. He scrolled past Margaret's. He didn't expect her to. But still, he hovered. There were no voicemails, no unread texts, just a silence so profound it felt like a verdict. He poured a drink, not scotch this time, just water, and stood by the window, looking out over the skyline. This used to be the view of victory. Now, it looked like a battlefield. He remembered a time years ago when he had stood in this very spot, calling Margaret after a big investor meeting. We did it, he had said. We're going global. And she had laughed. Just don't forget to bring home milk. He smiled at the memory, but the smile faltered. He had brought the world home and lost the only thing that made it worth bringing. The next morning, William did something unthinkable. He requested a meeting with Nathan Hart. To his surprise, Nathan agreed. The meeting wasn't held in a high-rise or a boardroom. It was at a small, local diner, quiet, no cameras, just two men sitting across from one another in a red leather booth that smelled of coffee and fried eggs. Nathan arrived first, calm and unreadable as always. William entered like a man walking into a confession. They sat in silence for a moment. Finally, William spoke. You know why I'm here. Nathan didn't nod. He just waited. I've made mistakes. William continued. More than I can count. I wanted everything, and I forgot what mattered. Nathan stirred his coffee. And now, I'm asking, if there's a way forward. Nathan looked up, not with anger, but with gravity. There's always a way forward, William. But the path you choose now, it won't look like the one you came from. William nodded. I'm not asking for Margaret back. I know that chapter's closed. I want to make things right. Where I can... Nathan leaned in. Then start by telling the truth, not to the press, not to investors, to yourself, and to your daughter when she's old enough to ask why her mother walked away. William's throat tightened. I still love her, he whispered, Nathan's voice was quiet, but firm. Then respect her enough to stop trying to own what you broke. A long silence fell. When they parted, there was no handshake, only an understanding. A week later, William held a press conference. He didn't deny the investigation. He didn't spin a narrative. He said leadership means accountability, not immunity. I failed my family. I failed this company. And for the first time in a long time, I'm listening again. He stepped down, not forced, voluntarily, back in Vermont. Margaret read the statement in the morning paper, her daughter's soft kicks pressing gently against her ribs. She didn't feel vindicated. She didn't feel triumphant. She felt peace. That was enough. Spring came late to Vermont that year. But when it did, it came gently like someone knocking at your door with a bouquet of forgiveness. At the Willow Creek estate, the snow finally melted into the earth, and buds emerged cautiously along the tree branches. Birds returned. The air smelled like soil and rain and beginnings. Margaret Prescott walked slowly through the back garden, now lined with sprouting daffodils. One hand rested on the curve of her belly. The other trailed along the fence her father had once built. She was due in 3 weeks. Everything inside her was preparing body, mind, heart, and something else too. Something quieter. Nathan Hart had taken to visiting most afternoons, usually under the pretense of helping her prepare the nursery or managing grant paperwork for Roots and Grace. But lately, the work had been replaced by something simpler. Tea, conversation, silence that didn't need filling. That day, he arrived with a single sunflower in hand. "For you," he said. It made me stop on the drive over. Thought that was worth respecting. Margaret smiled, her eyes soft. "You and your poetic instincts." He shrugged, setting the flower in a mason jar. "Blame the season. Everything's growing." She sat on the porch swing, motioning for him to join her. He did. They swayed in the quiet for a while. Finally, she asked, "Do you ever wonder if we're allowed to be happy again? Like, really happy?" Nathan didn't answer immediately. Instead, he leaned forward, elbows on knees. "I don't think happiness asks for permission. I think it shows up like spring unexpected, a little muddy and completely indifferent to your readiness." She laughed a small, surprised sound. "That sounds about right." He looked at her then, more serious now. "You've given yourself to others, to your daughter, to this community. But when was the last time you thought about what you want?" Margaret looked down at her hands. "I used to think wanting something for myself was selfish, that it made me weaker. And now. She paused, thoughtful. "I think maybe wanting something honest, something quiet and kind might be the strongest thing I've ever done." Nathan didn't move closer. He didn't need to. He just said, "When you're ready, I'll still be here." She met his eyes. There was no rush in her reply, only clarity. "I think I'm getting there." A week later, she gave birth. At a small birthing center surrounded by pine trees and morning birdsong, Grace Eleanor Prescott came into the world, 6 pounds, quiet, watchful, like her mother. Margaret held her to her chest, tears slipping silently down her cheeks, not from pain, but from the overwhelming feeling of wholeness. Nathan arrived the next morning with coffee and a soft, stuffed lamb. When he stepped into the room and saw Margaret holding Grace, something inside him shifted, not in fear, not in longing, in certainty. He stood there, unsure if he should speak. Margaret looked up and smiled. "She's perfect," he said. Margaret nodded. "She is. And I want her to grow up seeing what kindness looks like, what integrity looks like." Nathan swallowed. "Then she'll have a front row seat." They didn't kiss, not yet. But when Nathan placed the lamb next to Grace, and Margaret reached for his hand, it felt like the beginning of something both had earned, not through romance, but through reverence. The ceremony was small. No photographers, no press, just candles flickering in mason jars, a string quartet playing something soft, and a handful of people who mattered. It was held at Roots and Grace, the very space Margaret Prescott had once stood inside as a shell of herself and now returned to as its soul. She wore ivory, not a gown, just a simple linen dress that fell just above her ankles. Her hair was loose, a crown of fresh lavender tucked gently around her head. Grace Eleanor, now 5 months old, wore a pale yellow dress and slept through most of it. And Nathan Hart stood across from her, his eyes steady, voice low, holding her hands like they were something sacred. They didn't make grand vows. They promised presence. They promised laughter when life would allow it, and quiet companionship when it wouldn't. And when it was over, there were no champagne toasts, only warm cider, long embraces, and soft jazz echoing off the old stone walls. Margaret stood beneath the twinkle lights and watched as Grace stirred in Elaine's arms. She felt full, not with noise or attention, but with something rarer. Peace. Later that evening, long after the guests had left, Margaret stood outside on the wraparound porch, the night air cool against her arms. Nathan joined her, wrapping a shawl gently over her shoulders. "Cold?" he asked. "No," she said. "Just remembering." She looked out over the gravel path, the same one William Prescott had once driven up, uninvited and certain the world still owed him answers. He hadn't shown up today, and she was glad, but he had written a letter. No return address, no demands, just a single-page message. "Margaret, I watched the ceremony from the Foundation's live stream. You looked peaceful. I've never seen you that way before. I suppose I never gave you the space to be. I won't ask for anything. I only want to say thank you. Thank you for not becoming like me, for raising our daughter in a house built on truth, and for showing the world that strength doesn't need volume. I was wrong about so many things, but never about you." William Margaret folded the letter and placed it into the same box that held the note she had once written to Grace. She didn't cry. She didn't smile. She simply closed the box, then turned back toward the house, where Nathan was swaying slowly with Grace in his arms to the rhythm of a Louis Armstrong record. The past had spoken its last word, and it had spoken gently. Margaret stepped into the light, her voice soft but sure. She won't grow up remembering what we lost. She'll grow up knowing what we chose to build instead. She never raised her voice. She never tried to compete. She simply stood, and in doing so, reminded the world dignity doesn't shout, it stands. Margaret's story is not just hers. It belongs to every woman who's ever been told she's too quiet, too emotional, too much, or not enough. It's for every mother erased by a headline, every heart overlooked because it chose healing over hatred. And it's a reminder to all of us that strength isn't always in power plays and public victories. Sometimes, it's in walking away with your soul intact. But still, how many more Margarets are being silenced today? How often do we applaud the loudest, while forgetting those who carry their pain with grace? Let's stop rewarding betrayal just because it comes in expensive suits and shiny smiles. And let's start honoring resilience, not just when it's dramatic, but especially when it's quiet. If this story touched you, if it made you pause, don't keep it to yourself. Like, share, and subscribe to Shining Stories, where every week we bring you true, raw, and soul-deep stories that deserve to be heard, because healing begins when we start listening. And we can't wait to share the next one with you.